The piano had not made a single sound in 6 years. Not one note, not one whisper of melody, just silence. The kind of silence that sits inside your chest like a stone and never lets you breathe properly. Eleanor Whitmore knew that silence better than she knew her own heartbeat. She had lived inside it every single day since her mother closed her eyes for the last time and the music stopped. Eleanor was 51 years old, and by every measurable standard, she had won at life. Her publishing empire stretched across 14 countries. Her name appeared on the covers of business magazines. World leaders returned her calls. She had a mansion on a cliff overlooking the ocean near the quiet coastal town of Seabrook, and that mansion had 17 rooms, 4 fireplaces, and a garden that took 3 men to maintain. She had everything a human being was supposed to want. But every single evening, when the last assistant had gone home and the last email had been answered, Eleanor would walk into the music room, lower herself onto the antique bench beside the grand piano, and press her palm flat against its dark, polished surface. Not to play. She had never learned to play. She would just sit there with her hand resting on the wood, eyes closed, trying to remember what it sounded like when her mother played. Trying to hold on to something that kept slipping further and further away, like trying to catch water with open fingers. Her mother, Catherine Whitmore, had played that piano every Sunday afternoon without fail. It did not matter if she was tired, it did not matter if Eleanor had been difficult that week, which she often was as a teenager. It did not matter if the weather was miserable or the week had been hard. Sunday afternoon meant music. It meant Catherine sitting at that piano with her back perfectly straight and her fingers moving across the keys like they were having a private conversation with something sacred. The whole house would fill up with sound, warm, golden, alive. And for those 2 hours every week, everything wrong with the world seemed temporarily fixable. Then came the illness. 3 years of slow, quiet losing, and then nothing. The piano went silent the same week Catherine died. At first, Eleanor told herself it was coincidence, that old instruments sometimes needed tuning after periods of neglect. She called a technician. He came, he looked, he left with a check and a confused expression. The piano still would not play. She called another, then another. Then she started flying in specialists, men and women with decades of experience, with awards framed on their office walls, with waiting lists years long. One flew in from Vienna, one came from Tokyo. A pair of brothers from Florence arrived with a van full of equipment that cost more than most people's houses. They all left the same way, quietly, without an answer. The technicians replaced strings. They rebuilt the internal hammer mechanism piece by piece. They examined every inch of the soundboard under specialized lighting. They ran diagnostics with equipment that could apparently detect problems invisible to the human eye. Nothing worked. Every repair seemed to make the silence worse somehow, as though the piano was becoming more absent with each attempt, more hollow, more gone. After 4 years of this, Eleanor stopped calling experts. She simply lived with the broken piano the way you live with a scar. You stop looking at it directly, but you never forget it is there. It was a Tuesday in early March when everything changed. The gardens were being prepared for spring, and Eleanor was standing at the kitchen window with her morning coffee growing cold in her hand, watching the groundskeeping crew work in the pale morning light. That was when she noticed Samuel. Samuel Hayes had worked on the estate for nearly a decade. He was somewhere in his early 70s, though he moved with a quietness that made his age difficult to read. He was not particularly tall, his hands were rough and brown from years of outdoor work, and he wore the same faded green jacket every day regardless of the weather. And he had a way of moving through the estate that was almost invisible, not because he was trying to disappear, but because he was so completely at peace with wherever he was, that he never disturbed anything. He arrived before sunrise and left after sunset, and in 10 years, Eleanor had probably spoken to him fewer than 30 times. She knew his name because it was on her payroll. That was the extent of it. But that Tuesday morning, Samuel was not looking at the garden. He was standing perfectly still outside the music room window, which Eleanor had left open to let in the cold sea air, and he was staring at the piano.
Not glancing, not casually noticing, staring at it the way you stare at something you knew a long time ago, the way you look at a face you knew a long time ago. Eleanor watched him for almost 2 full minutes. There was something in his posture, a stillness inside a stillness that she could not explain and could not look away from. She opened the side door and walked out into the cold morning. "Samuel," she said. He turned and his expression was immediately apologetic, as though he had been caught doing something wrong. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "No," she said, and she heard herself say the next words before she had consciously decided to say them. "Do you play?" He was quiet for a moment. The sea wind moved through the garden around them. "A long time ago," he said, "I did something like that." She laughed softly because sometimes you laugh when you do not know what else to do. Every expert in the world has tried to fix that piano and failed. Maybe you should take a turn. She meant it as a gentle joke, a small kindness to a kind old man on a cold morning. Samuel looked at the piano through the open window for another long moment. Then he looked back at her. "May I try?" he asked, and his voice was so calm, so free of any performance or pretension, that Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, something quieter than hope, something more like the feeling you get just before the sun comes out, when the light has not arrived yet, but the quality of the air has already changed. "Yes," she said, "please." The next morning, Samuel arrived carrying a worn leather bag, soft with age, the kind of bag that has been carried so many times it has taken on the shape of the person who carries it. He came into the music room without ceremony, and Eleanor stepped back and let him work. Staff members drifted in and out through the morning, curious, some of them grinning with polite skepticism. The groundskeeper was going to fix what 11 professional restorers could not? The idea seemed almost comical, but there was something about the way Samuel worked that made laughter feel inappropriate. He moved around the piano like he was having a conversation with it. He would press a key and then wait, listening to the absence of sound the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. He would open a panel, look inside, close it again, sit for 5 minutes with his eyes shut. He touched the wood the way you touch something you have missed. By afternoon, the staff had drifted away. Only Eleanor remained, sitting in the corner chair with a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of. She watched Samuel work and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt still. At sunset, he stood up slowly and said, "I need 1 more day." She nodded and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He came back the next morning before the sun was fully up. Eleanor heard him arrive and lay in her bed listening to the faint sounds drifting up from the music room below. The soft click of the bag opening, the barely audible creak of the piano lid, the occasional light tap of a tool against wood. She lay there in the gray morning light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something was about to happen. 2 hours later, it did. A single note rose through the mansion like a question, clear and round and perfect, the way notes sound when an instrument has found its voice again after a long silence. Eleanor sat up. Another note followed, then a third. And then, before she had made any conscious decision to move, she was out of bed and down the stairs and standing in the doorway of the music room in her dressing gown with both hands pressed to her mouth. Samuel was playing. He played slowly at first, carefully, the way you walk back into a room you have not entered in years. But then something opened up and the melody came through fully. The same melody, the exact same Sunday afternoon melody that Catherine Whitmore had played 1,000 times in this very room. The melody that Eleanor had been trying to hold in her memory for 6 years like water in her hands. It was all still there, every note. Every turn, every quiet, golden, heartbreaking measure of it. The security guard at the front entrance heard it and walked inside without thinking. The 2 assistants who had come in early stopped moving and stood completely still in the hallway. The young gardener who had been working outside the window sat down in the wet grass and put his face in his hands. Eleanor herself sank slowly to the floor, right there in the doorway, and pressed her back against the frame and wept. Not the desperate, frightened crying of grief, Something different. Something that had been locked away for 6 years finally being allowed to come out into the open air. The piano was not broken anymore. Her mother was not gone anymore. Not entirely. Not while that melody was in the room. Later, when the music stopped and the house had grown quiet again in a completely different way than it had been quiet before, Eleanor sat across from Samuel and asked him how. He was quiet for a long time, in the way he was always quiet, not avoidant, just honest with himself about what he wanted to say. He told her that 40 years ago, he had been a concert piano designer of some international reputation, not famous, but known. Respected in a world where that kind of respect is very specifically earned. His instruments had been played in concert halls across Europe and Japan. Young musicians had written to him. He had loved his work the way you love something that you feel you were made to do. Then his daughter, who was 7 years old and had her mother's laugh and his own habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something, became seriously ill. The kind of illness that takes years and everything you have and still makes no promises. Samuel had spent those years entirely present for her, not distracted by career or ambition or the fear of what he was losing professionally. Just present, entirely there, every day. When she died, he was holding her hand. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He walked away from piano design after that, not because he was broken, though he was broken, but because the work felt too large for the person he had become. He needed quiet. He needed to do things with his hands that required attention, but not grief. He needed to tend to things that grew slowly and did not ask anything of his heart. He had been doing that ever since. The problem with the piano, he explained, had been a structural shift deep inside the casing, something that created a specific pattern of resonance interference that defeated modern diagnostic tools because it was the kind of thing you could only understand if you had spent decades learning how these instruments thought. Every expert who came had looked for a complicated answer. Samuel had looked for a true one, and experience, quiet and patient and unimpressed with itself, had led him directly to it. Eleanor listened to all of this, and when he finished, she did not say anything for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "I had no idea." "No," he said, "that's all right." It was not all right, and they both knew it, but there was no accusation in him. That was the remarkable thing about Samuel Hayes. He had been overlooked for 10 years by a woman who considered herself compassionate and attentive, and he held no resentment about it at all. He had simply continued to be exactly who he was, in his faded green jacket, arriving before sunrise and leaving after sunset, carrying a depth of experience and loss and skill that nobody had thought to ask about. In the months that followed, Eleanor could not stop thinking about this, about how many people she walked past every day whose full humanity she had never once considered, about how many remarkable inner lives existed behind uniforms and name badges and job titles she had never bothered to learn. She had spent her career publishing stories about extraordinary people, without ever thinking to look for them in the people immediately around her. She built a program. It started small, a few dozen employees across her company, career assessments, educational sponsorships, mentorship opportunities. Within a year, it had expanded. Within 3 years, it had helped nearly 400 people move into careers that reflected what they were actually capable of. Former warehouse workers became structural engineers. A woman who had cleaned Eleanor's office for 8 years turned out to have a gift for financial analysis and was now managing a portfolio. A man who had driven Eleanor's car for 5 years had a novel published. Samuel was offered positions at several prestigious institutions when his story became known. He accepted one, a teaching role at a school for young instrument makers, where he spent his mornings in a workshop surrounded by people young enough to be his grandchildren, teaching them that the most important tool they would ever have was not the one in their hand, but the patience in their character. Eleanor still walks into the music room every Sunday afternoon. She still cannot play, but she sits on the bench and she listens to the silence, which is no longer the same silence as before. It is a silence full of something now, full of Samuel's hands moving carefully over keys, full of her mother's voice, which she can almost hear again when she closes her eyes, full of the strange and humbling knowledge that the most important things in your life are sometimes standing just outside your window, tending to the garden, waiting patiently to be noticed. The piano had never been the miracle. The miracle had always been the man in the faded green jacket, the man nobody saw, until one cold Tuesday morning in March when someone finally looked.